inflation because of things like housing, things like water and electricity. So that's reason for concern, right? And I think that's the second point after making the point that income levels are still not where they should be. We've seen that the currency has been under a lot of pressure. If you monitor the central bank forward auction of dollars every week or every 2 weeks, you can see that the demand for dollars is 4 times almost what the central bank is putting. And that has brought a lot of pressure on the cedi, to the point where in the interbank market, right, the rate that banks use among themselves to exchange dollars, the rate is almost already at 7 to the dollar, 6.8. So the reference rate of the Bank of Ghana, of course, is lower, but it gives you a sense that it's just a matter of time before we get there. So from the currency side, there's also reasons to pause. But the elephant in the room, and of course the biggest issue that has led us to where we are in terms of having this conversation, is the shape of public finance, the precarious shape of public finance after the pandemic. Because the side effect of the major interventions that took place in 2020 is that we've been left with a very high fiscal deficit and of course a very high debt. Per our estimate of 2021, the deficit was around 12%, while debt to GDP was around 80 to 83%. Let that sink in. That's very high, okay? And I think that the past speakers mentioned how high interest payment to revenue were, or debt service to revenue, and we know that these things are putting a lot of pressure on the government. This compare, of course, to a deficit of 15.6 in 2020 and a debt to GDP ratio of around 79 in 2020. So we've moved from a situation of single-digit deficit and debt below 70% to a situation of double-digit deficit and very high level of debt. And unfortunately, the way this has translated is into a worsening of the financing conditions, right? When you go see somebody to give you money, he looks at how much your balance sheet is already encumbered with debt, right? So you may recall that around mid-October last year, the premium that Ghana pays on the international capital market increased to more than 10%, de facto making Ghana lose access to international market, capital market. We've also seen that in the local bond market, the rate at which the government is borrowing, let's say for a 2-year paper, has moved from around 17% to 20%. So overall, the macroeconomic environment is getting more and more complicated. And I think more recently, Friday, we've seen that for the first time in a long time, rating agencies have downgraded Ghana. And for one, Moody's, for the first time ever, Ghana has moved to the C bucket. So the picture is quite complicated, it's quite difficult, and it's all down to the persistent structural and structural fiscal and debt problems. That's the first reason. And the second reason that comes from, when you read a report of the rating agencies or you talk to investors, is the perceived lack of credibility in the fiscal part, in the part that the budget is giving to reduce the debt levels of the country. Now, what has come out post-COVID is a policy situation that is, you have more trade-off to deal with as a government. Not only you need to raise additional revenues because it's needed, and that's a problem that was already there before the pandemic. But there is also the pressure of increasing spending, perhaps more than ever, to facilitate the recovery. And last but not least, because of the debt levels that you've reached, you also need to find a solution to reduce the debt. So these three things are trade-offs that are very complicated to solve, right? While before 2019, the focus was almost solely on domestic revenue mobilization, what has happened in 2020 is that, and that's expected in a crisis situation, spending have shifted up by more than 50%. You do that in a crisis period. It's called counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But the expectation is that this is not permanent. You need to reverse back to the trend that where you were before. Unfortunately, and that's the challenge with the current fiscal path, it wants to stay on the same trend with less money and less income. So it seems like a very difficult equation to solve, and one that naturally should lead the debate away from debt revenue mobilization, which remains important, but focus more strongly on streamlining spending and addressing debt. And I think that in the debate that we've seen, luckily the speakers here are aware of this, but in the media there is a disproportionate focus on e-levy to plug a gap. The issue is not about plugging a gap. The issue is about finding the revenue for sure, but also streamlining spending. And I think that you have seen, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, and that's really to the credit of the ministry, an announcement that spending will need to be cut by 20%. Because there's a realization that it's no longer just a domestic revenue mobilization issue, right? But I think that 2 points are important to make here. And, you know, unlike the perception that the IMF imposes just austerity, we want to be very forceful in saying that fiscal consolidation needs to be mindful of the poor. Programs that like the LEAP program for social protection, all these need to be safeguarded as we do fiscal consolidation. I think that needs to be front and center. The measures that are adopted, including revenue measures, need to be more progressive. And I think the speakers made the point that currently the e-levy doesn't seem to pass that test. And I will leave it at that. That's the first point. The second point is that given the global uncertainty because of the trajectory of the pandemic or because of financing conditions, the Federal Reserve in the US tightening its rate, and what are the implications for emerging markets, there is really a premium on having a clear medium-term fiscal path. And unfortunately, as we speak now, we're still not there, right? In the sense that we need to give a sense of how the debt is going to come down, what are the measures that will help us meet the very ambitious targets in the budget, you know, to have a deficit of 7.4 and a primary of 0.1. Revenue measures were adopted, some were shelved, like the benchmark value. The 20% cut was announced. It needs probably to be specific, right? To, you know, including for the investors, it needs to be specific on what exactly are we talking about. So given the uncertainty that we see around, there is a premium on being a bit more precise. Now, to the question of the IMF, and I think that a lot of things have been said, but let me just remind everybody of the three functions of the IMF, okay? We do three things. We do policy advice, we do technical assistance, and we do lending. And I will say lending with conditionalities. But let's not fool ourselves. The conditionalities are things that you need to do yourself even if you don't come to the IMF. There's no alternative universe where you can get your way out of these difficulties by doing something else. So I think there is so much emphasis on the conditionalities that it seems that they come out of nowhere. These are negotiated reforms that need to happen in order to get yourself out of the difficult situation. And for this reason, we have no doubt that a program with the IMF will be extremely helpful in the current situation. But we are mindful, and we've had these conversations, that that's not the direction that the government wants to take. And I think that, and I'll call on all the stakeholders, the focus should be on what else needs to happen. Fine, the IMF is not a solution. Let's focus on the reforms. Let's focus on the spending streamlining. Let's focus on the policy package that is out there to fix the problems that I have listed. That's where the focus should be. We are the lender of last resort. If eventually we get there, it's too bad or it's too good, I don't know, but I think that the debate should not be on e-levy versus IMF. I think it's even unfair to the e-levy, right? Because a program with the IMF is a package of reform. The e-levy is, let's plug a gap somewhere to do a few things. So that's not even comparable, and I will agree with the previous speakers that that's the case. So the debate about the IMF is probably something that at this stage is only academic. But I think the focus, and I'll call on all the stakeholders on what needs to be done. And I think that there are a couple of months before the medium-term review to really make sure that, a sound policy package, right, one that meets the stakeholders or consensus within the country, can be put in place to give a sense of what is the medium-term fiscal path that the country wants to follow in order to address all these issues.